Welcome to the Changelog, episode 0.2.3. I'm Adam Stakoviak.
And I am Wynn Netherland. This is the Changelog. We cover what's fresh and new in the world of open source. If you found us on iTunes, we're also on the web at thechangelog.com, and we're also up on GitHub.
If you go there, you'll see some trending repos, some feature repos from the blog, as well as the audio podcasts. We're also on Twitter, so follow us with Changelog Show, not the Changelog. And I am Adam Stack.
And I am Penguin, Pengwynn. I'm fresh back from Oklahoma City, Red Dirt Ruby Conf.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun up there, I bet, huh?
Yeah, it was. A lot of smart folks. Got to see a keynote from Jim Wyrick and Dave Thomas.
Oh, yeah.
A couple of guys that have forgotten more Ruby than I'll ever learn. A lot of JavaScript going on, too. Interviewed Charles Lowell, a.k.a. Cowboy D, on Twitter and GitHub about Ruby Racer.
He's got some exciting projects here.
Yeah, some embedded JavaScript within Ruby. One embeds Ruby Racer embeds the Google V8 engine, and Ruby Rhino embeds Mozilla's Rhino JavaScript engine. I have to apologize up front for the audio of this interview. We did it live. We'll do it live. Okay, Bill O'Reilly.
Yeah,
we did it live there at the conference, and live events are always fun.
Yeah, there's always some sort of glitch you got to deal with, and quality of the audio is always one that goes first. So
please excuse that, but otherwise it's a fun episode, commute-friendly format this week. A couple of programming notes. We'll be at Texas JavaScript on the 5th of next month, 5th of June in Austin, Texas. Great lineup there.
Yeah. Also be at Less Conflict on this month as well. Next week, as a matter of fact, out in Atlanta, Georgia.
Is that next week? I thought it was 3010 that you were going out there.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's 100 years from now, right? Well,
right.
millennium.
Millennium from now.
Either way, it's in the future. But lots and lots of fun, but yeah.
You have a DeLorean you're going to get out there?
I think so, yeah. I'm going to get to 85 and zing my butt over to Atlanta.
Let me know how the future turns out, buddy.
Will do.
Cool. Well, let's get to this episode. Episode 0.2.3 of the Changelog. I'm your host, Wynn Netherland. We're joined today by Charles Lowell and Gregg Pollack from Ruby 5. Greg, why don't you, Charles, introduce yourself, tell the folks who you are and why they should care.
My name is Charles Lowell. I work with Frontside Software, and we build user interfaces for a variety of platforms. But we do a lot of Ruby.
Lots of Ruby. Tell us about Ruby Racer.
The Ruby Racer is the V8 JavaScript interpreter embedded into Ruby. So what it means, in fact, is that you can evaluate JavaScript from inside Ruby, and you can call Ruby functions from inside JavaScript.
Okay, this is Greg, by the way. I enjoyed your presentation earlier today, but as a Ruby developer, I can look at this and I totally see the value in being able to write Ruby to test my JavaScript. And I'm sorry if it sounds ignorant, but what I'd really like to learn more about are some use cases where I really might want to write, Ruby that writes JavaScript that writes Ruby. What are some use cases? Where might this be really useful that it's not totally obvious?
So you can do things. One of the examples I gave was if you have templates, for example, if you want to evaluate on the server and on the client. If that template image is written in JavaScript, then you can evaluate them in both places. And so you're not going to be repeating yourself either with the templates or with the actual code that evaluates the templates, if that makes sense.
So these templates you're talking about, something like Mustache.js? Or?
Yes.
For the folks that may not be aware, who's used Mustache.js? A few hands. Why don't you give the folks some background on what this is?
Has anyone used Mustache RB? Have you used this technique where you use them in concert, where you use the same templates on the client and the server? Okay, so Mustache is a templating engine that has both an implementation in JavaScript and an implementation in Ruby, but it has the same syntax. Choose one implementation with the same syntax. That way you're guaranteed to get the exact same result.
Why is an interpreter like this, required for that sort of thing?
Well, because if you're, like I said, if you're using the exact same implementation, like suppose you want to extend your syntax, right? you're going to have to do that. If you're using two different languages, two different implementations, you're going to have to change both implementations. So a change to your make is going to be recognized twice. If you have a bird environment, it's going to be recognized in triplicate. So if you can bring the exact same implementation to all your different runtimes, then you're cutting that out of the equation.
So in the case of template rendering, the one way maybe you can look at this is like you would normally have to do all the template rendering on the server side, but maybe you could save some CPU cycles by pushing that off to your clients, letting the clients do the work, and using the same format, the same language.
Absolutely, and you're just sending data to the client. You're not actually, you're not sending display data. You're sending the data that's rendered on the client.
So earlier today you said that sending HTML over the wire was an abomination. I believe that certain Rubyists out there took issue with this. He'll remain nameless, but his Twitter handle is GLV. So why don't you explain to Glenn what you meant by that?
To clarify, HTML itself is not an abomination, but using it as a data structure is an abomination.
No, his question was, isn't this what the browser does?
Well, for the browser, one person's code is another person's data, and so forth. I mean, it's the browser's job to use it as data to render.
But from our perspective, it's a view. And using a view to house data, to me, is a smell.
So for those that didn't catch the talk, you're proposing an alternative that sends what?
Just JSON.
Pure JSON.
Or, something else if that strikes your fancy.
Sure. Question from the audience.
The 3 times faster to just shove a chunk of HTML into DOM that just doesn't browser. That doesn't matter.
Well, you work for Google. I mean, come on, you've seen the banana and the potato chips and everything like that. It shouldn't matter in the age of Chrome.
So the question was the performance impact of each approach, right?
Right. It might be slightly less performant, although honestly, I have not noticed that rendering it on the client is less performant. I mean, not so much that it would actually even cause me to investigate, I suppose.
So ironically, the question was from a Googler, and in Ruby Racer, you're actually embedding Google's V8 engine.
Yes.
So this is one of those few gems out there that actually requires Python.
Yes, it requires Python to build. So you don't actually ever see it, but when you're installing, in its current form, it does take a while. And then it says compiling native extensions. This might take a while. It's actually using Python and scons, which is what V8 uses for its build system to build the V8 binary. So yeah, it does. I think you need Python 2.4 or greater to install this gem.
Talk a minute about consuming this particular project. So you can evaluate JavaScript context by passing a Ruby object, or you can have a Ruby object be the context.
Yes. So you can actually, if you have any arbitrary Ruby instance, you can set up your JavaScript's context so that Ruby instance is the global object. So any properties that Ruby object has are global properties. Any methods that it has are global functions. And so, for example, if you could actually have a browser object that had a window property and a document property and an embedded DOM and so forth, and that would be how you would implement a browser a browser in Ruby, or at least the skeleton of one.
So if you have a Ruby object as a global JavaScript value, does Douglas Crockford still cry?
You'd have to ask Douglas about that.
Back to templating for a second. Mustache.js, you mentioned. Any other templating engines out there that are your favorites?
JSON template is one that I like very much. It's a very functional style templating system. And that also is, I believe, from Google.
Any love for _JS?
I have never used it.
Blasphemy.
Smacking on the hands with a ruler.
Check out episode 5 with Jeremy Ashkenas. I finally pronounced his name correctly.
One of the things you mentioned on your README here is that Ruby Racer is designed to let you evaluate JavaScript as safely as possible unless you tell it to do something more dangerous. Can you talk a little bit about what you might use this for?
By default, when you instantiate a JavaScript context in the Ruby Racer, you don't have anything except for the standard JavaScript objects. So even though it's possible to call Ruby code, you can't. You have to explicitly inject into that context the code which you can call. And that's important because one of the primary uses of JavaScript is to safely evaluate untrusted code, just like you do on the browser. And so it's important that by default it be safe. So once you start exposing bits of your application via JavaScript, in other words, making Ruby classes and Ruby functions available, then you do so at your own peril, and you need to make sure that those functions are safe. So that's what I'm getting at. Is by default, it is safe.
So you could almost use it to expose some sort of API that allows people to write JavaScript, which gets evaluated server side?
Yes. It gets evaluated as Ruby. So those even though it looks like you're calling JavaScript, you're actually calling Ruby.
Interesting. So this might be used for some sort of API where people have to write like some sort of JavaScript code. JavaScript code is kind of universal. If people had to write really complex code, which then gets evaluated on your proprietary locked behind closed door server that they couldn't be running on their own, this would be a way to allow them to write some pretty sophisticated API logic.
Precisely. It allows you to provide an API that allows users of that API to extend it and use it in ways that you had not foreseen. In the same way that the browser allows servers to program it to make it do new and interesting things. Things that, have taken us, really advanced the state of the art in the last 5 years or so. And so, to give it a concrete example, and another one that I showed here that we've used it for is to actually for an image server. So being able to pull down images and then have a set of JavaScript functions that actually are bound to Ruby functions that modify the image before it's returned, so you can enhance the image in pretty much arbitrary ways, or any arbitrary combination of the primitives that you provide on that server.
That's cool. One other web service this reminds me of, there was a voice over IP web service that we were working with at Envy Labs for a while, where basically you had to write code and then either you could upload to the server or you specified, go to this URL, download this code, and we'll execute it using our voice over IP servers, and whatever happens after that point. And they actually had like a Ruby implementation. This is, I think, the Trovo API, which we'll talk about in Ruby 5 this week. So they tried to implement in different languages. You could write in Ruby, you could write in Python, you could write in JavaScript, and they did a couple other languages maybe. But it kind of makes sense that JavaScript seems to be sort of that standard library that if you're going to support a language that gets interpreted by your application server side, it seems to be the standard. And I totally see the value in being able to specify, have a sort of sandbox, so to speak. It sandboxes your Ruby code so that, you can let people run JavaScript against it without having to worry about them doing anything dangerous.
Yeah, it's a super lightweight virtual machine in a box, basically, that you can take with you wherever you go. And it's light by purpose. I mean, there's only 9 standard objects in the JavaScript library, or standard constructors. You can fit all of them on your 2 hands, and that's a feature.
So JavaScript everywhere. Someone made the comment in one of the talks today that C was the lingua franca of computing, especially in the Unix world. And I think perhaps JavaScript may be, unseating it at some point. It's not as entrenched on the server, but with the rise of Node.js and some of these server-side frameworks, it seems like everybody is using JavaScript these days in places that we normally didn't use it before. How many folks are using JavaScript in their applications? How many folks, and it's pretty much the whole room, how many folks are using it server-side? Oh, wow, more hands than you think. Talk a minute about what makes JavaScript special and why JavaScript, this renaissance of JavaScript in the last couple of years.
I mean, I honestly don't know if I'm qualified to talk to the renaissance of JavaScript on the server side, because from my perspective, I like to use it for its original purpose, which is a language for embedding and providing, safe interfaces. So, I mean, while I think that Node is interesting and the common JS movement is useful and that the project is useful, for me that part of JavaScript is just not as interesting, frankly, just because it's yet another language and doesn't bring along all the things that I think don't really highlight the things that I think make JavaScript really special. And that is the fact that you can completely control the environment. You can control its heap size. You can control how the instructions get executed, and you can embed other interfaces into it safely.
It's not just on the server; it's on the client as well. And just in my brief career, I guess I've been doing web development for about 12 years now, and it seems like that early on, I guess that we were shackled to the DOM. Right, and so JavaScript was something that we handled with kind of like hazmat gloves, and we had all these server-side routines that created the JavaScript for us. Whereas, in the last few years, basically since prototype and since jQuery came along, there's been this sort of rebirth of JavaScript development. Where I think we're finding a lot of the things that we like about Ruby are things we like about JavaScript as well.
Absolutely.
Talk a minute about Ruby Rhino and how it relates to Ruby Racer.
So the Ruby Rhino is the JRuby counterpart to the Ruby Racer. And as the name might imply, rather than being based on the V8 JavaScript interpreter, it's based on the Mozilla Rhino JavaScript interpreter. I've taken some care to make them API compatible so that you can, but I'm going to say there is some discrepancy in the API, but the idea is that you can use the exact same code in a JRuby application with a little bit of glue to bootstrap and say, okay, I'm using the Rhino, not the Racer. So, but starting from there, being able to run the exact same code.
Forget for a moment that we have a Googler in the room. What's the main differences between the two? V8 and Rhino.
Okay. Well, the main difference from my perspective, obviously one being written in C and the other in Java, is that probably the most important is that the V8 is not multi-threaded. So if you're going to be using it in a multi-threaded app, you're going to have to lock the interpreter with basically a global interpreter lock. V8 has the same thing as Ruby and Python and all that good stuff. Whereas Rhino is multi-threaded. You can enter context from all different threads. The threading is really great on the Java platform. So that's probably the biggest difference for me. And then obviously with the Ruby Rhino, you get Java integration inside your JavaScript as well as from Ruby because you're using JRuby.
This is an abbreviated version of the show since we have the second podcast to record. This is usually where we ask, and I'll put you on the spot since I don't think we call it a single episode of the changelog, but this is normally we ask the folks, what's on your open source radar? What projects, other than the ones we just talked about, have you excited?
Which ones have me excited? Gosh, well, I've been looking at env.js. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that, but that's basically a complete DOM implementation in JavaScript that is somewhat cross-platform. So you have you can with just a little bit of native code, whether that's Ruby, and by native I mean native platform. It can be Ruby, Java, or C. You can have a DOM implementation up and running. So I think that's really interesting, and that lets you do more simulated browser stuff. So if you want to do screen scraping and complex interaction with websites programmatically, that plays a big part, along with unit testing your JavaScript code. I'm also looking at JS DOM, which is another nascent implementation that's not quite nearly as far along, but is shows some promise in terms of being maybe a little bit more flexible. So let's see what else. I say you have to just look what I'm following on GitHub. That's the best place to check it out. The GitHub page is github.com/cowboyd. So you also have your own podcast? Yes. You want to plug in? Oh, absolutely. I have the drunkenretired.com podcast, so you can go to drunkenretired.com.
It's not drunk and tired. I actually tried that earlier. I didn't catch it. It's
not
retired,
drunk and tired.
So that's a totally different site.
That we try to do every week with my good friend Michael Cote from Red Monk. So you should check it out.
Talking about?
Yes. Talking pretty much about life, the universe, and everything. Our motto is it's better than half the stuff out there.
That's our motto. Cool. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Changelog. Point your browser to tail.thechangelog.com to find out what's going on right now in open source. Also be sure to head to github.com/explore to catch up on trending and feature repos as well as the latest episodes of the Changelog.